for Oberleutnant Karl Weiss of the 357th Artillery Regiment. The morning unfolded like countless others along the Normandy coast. A damp, grey mist clung to the English Channel, softening every sound. The air was cold, heavy with salt and wet soil. It was just past 5 a.m. Another shift. Another day of tense anticipation. But as he raised his binoculars and the first light touched the horizon, he noticed the sea was shifting. It wasn't the tide. It wasn't a storm front. It was something unreal. A dark streak had formed where the sea met the sky, spreading, sharpening, and multiplying with each passing moment. This was no ordinary fleet. It was a vast city of steel, a floating fortress emerging from the fog and into destiny. In that instant, before a single Allied boot touched the sand, before anyone had heard the names Omaha or Utah, he understood that the Reich was about to be swallowed whole. To grasp the impact of that morning, one must step into the mindset of Fortress Europe in the spring of 1944. From Norway's shores to the Spanish frontier, German engineers had raised the Atlantic Wall. It was envisioned as a line of concrete and steel, armed to the teeth, an unbreakable shield against any assault. To the German High Command, and in the propaganda fed to its troops, it stood as a symbol of the Reich's strength. But Oberleutnant Richter, a career soldier and veteran of the Eastern Front, understood the gap between illusion and truth. At 32, he was old enough to recall another Germany, yet young enough to have been forged by the fire of war. Practical, watchful, and utterly wary, he led an artillery battery equipped with well-placed check-made guns. Secured within concrete bunkers, a few miles inland from the stretch of coast the Allies would later name Omaha. From his lookout, a reinforced bunker set into a high bluff, he held a clear view of the sea. Day after day, he and his men trained without pause. They worked out firing ranges, kept their weapons in order, and gazed across the dull, empty sea. The conversation always circled back to the invasion. Tag X. The long-awaited day of days. But when would it arrive? And more importantly, where? German intelligence was convinced the main blow would strike at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest stretch of the Channel. It made perfect sense. That was where the 15th Army, the core of Germany's western defences, stood ready. Normandy, by contrast, was seen as secondary, perhaps a diversion, but never the true target. This was a massive strategic miscalculation. And it was no accident. It was the result of a brilliant Allied deception campaign called Operation Fortitude, and it left the Normandy defenders dangerously exposed. RTR's unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, was better than most in the area, but it was still just a shadow of the elite forces that had conquered France 4 years earlier. It was a mix of seasoned veterans from the East like himself and a larger number of very young teenage conscripts and older reservists. They were brave and dutiful, but they weren't the stormtroopers of 1940. They were defenders tasked with holding a line that was stretched far too thin. The Atlantic Wall itself was more of a patchwork than a solid wall. Many bunkers were incomplete. Minefields had gaps. The vast distances meant even a powerful strong point could be isolated and bypassed. Richter knew this. He had seen the shortcuts local farmers still used, the blind spots in the fields of fire. He had a professional skepticism about their chances against a truly determined assault. In the weeks leading up to June, the tension had been a living thing. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with improving the defences, had been a whirlwind of activity. He ordered millions of mines and thousands of jagged steel obstacles placed on the beaches. The men called them Rommel's asparagus. Rommel understood a truth that the High Command in Berlin seemed to ignore. If the Allies weren't defeated on the beaches in the first 24 hours, the war in the West would be lost. Allied air power would shred any German reinforcements trying to move to the coast. The first day was the only day that mattered. But on June 5th, the weather turned. A storm blew in with high winds and rough seas. The German Meteorological Office confidently predicted an invasion would be impossible for days. This forecast allowed many senior officers to relax. It was why Rommel himself wasn't even in France. He had gone home to Germany for his wife's birthday. The storm would keep them safe. So, as RTR stood watch in the pre-dawn chill of June 6th, the mood was routine. The storm had passed, but the sea was still choppy. No one expected a thing. He was looking east when he first saw it. A flicker. He raised his powerful Zeiss binoculars and focused. His heart, which had been beating in the slow rhythm of a night watch, began to hammer against his ribs. It wasn't a flicker. It was ships, not a patrol, not a raiding party. Hundreds of them. And behind them more and more still. He swept his binoculars left and right. Everywhere he looked, it was the same. The sea was no longer grey water. It was a solid mass of dark, menacing shapes. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. It was the feeling of a man looking at a math problem he could not possibly solve. For a long moment, RTR just couldn't process it. The sheer scale was an insult to logic. German intelligence had estimated the Allies might muster 3,000 vessels for an invasion. And even that would have been a monumental effort. What he was looking at was something else entirely. He tried to count, but it was a fool's errand. His brain, on instinct, began to categorize. He could make out the hulking silhouettes of battleships and cruisers. He saw swarms of smaller, faster destroyers circling them like wolves. And then there were the others, the endless, uncountable others. Landing craft of all shapes and sizes, packed so densely they looked like iron filings drawn to a magnet. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The image didn't change. It only grew clearer as the sun began its slow climb. The official number for the entire operation would later be confirmed at nearly 7,000 vessels, an armada from 8 different nations. It remains the largest amphibious invasion force in history. But to RTOR, it wasn't a statistic. It was a physical presence that seemed to bend the horizon. It was a declaration of industrial power so immense that it made everything he'd ever known about warfare obsolete. Germany had built a wall of concrete. The Allies had responded by building a bridge of steel. He grabbed the field telephone, his hands slick with sweat. "This is RTOR at observation post 4. I have a visual on the channel. There are ships." The voice on the other end was tired, dismissive. "We have reports of a few ships over Leutnant. A possible raid. Stand by." "No." Rata's voice was strained, urgent. "You don't understand. It's not a few ships. It is thousands." The entire sea is covered from horizon to horizon. This is it. This is the invasion. There was a pause. Disbelief. RTOR could almost hear the man picturing him as a hysterical junior officer, spooked by shadows. Oberleutnant. The sea conditions are not suitable. Our reports show your reports are wrong, Rorter shouted, his voice cracking. I am looking at it with my own eyes. For God's sake, look at the sea. He slammed the phone down in frustration. It was too big to be believed. He tried another line to regimental headquarters and found his commanding officer. RTOR, here, sir. The invasion fleet is here. 10,000 ships. He knew he was exaggerating, but in that moment, it felt like an understatement. The major's voice was skeptical. RTOR, are you certain? The weather. The weather is clear enough to see the end of the world. Major, and it is sitting in the English Channel, requesting permission to open fire. This time, the urgency cut through. The chain of command was paralyzed by a failure of imagination. Their plans, their maps, their intelligence reports, all of it was being erased by the reality floating a few miles away. While RTOR was watching the fleet, the High Command was focused on reports of parachutists inland, assuming they were the main event. No one was looking at the sea. RTR didn't wait for them. He shouted orders to his men. Roused by the commotion, they stared out from their positions, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. They saw what he saw. The drills were over. This was real. The heavy shells were brought up from the magazines. Rangefinders called out numbers that seemed impossibly large. The giant barrels of the cannons, silent for so long, elevated slowly, pointing their noses toward the impossible fleet. RTOR stood in his post. Binoculars pressed to his eyes. He could see the landing craft beginning to form up. He could feel the vibration in the air. A low hum of thousands of engines. It was the sound of a superpower breathing, and he was about to throw the first stone. The order finally came just before 6 a.m. Engage at will. For RTOR. It was a release. The paralysis of disbelief was broken by the familiar clarity of action. Fire. He roared into the telephone. A moment later, the ground trembled as the first gun fired. Then a second, and a third. The shells screamed out over the water. RTR tracked them through his binoculars. A surge of professional pride mixing with his dread, he saw plumes of water erupt in the midst of the fleet. A miss, then another. His men were good. They adjusted their aim, firing with a disciplined rhythm. And for a brief moment, they made their mark. RTOR saw a direct hit on an American destroyer, the USS Corey. There was a flash of orange and a puff of black smoke. While some accounts suggest the ship may have also struck a mine, from RTOR's perspective, his guns had drawn first blood as the ship listed, crippled, and later sinking. A cheer went up from his men. For a few minutes, it felt like a real battle. It felt like their training mattered. But the feeling was fleeting because after the quarry was hit, the fleet did not scatter. It didn't slow down. The gap in the formation was simply filled. The endless lines of ships kept coming. An iron tide that couldn't be stopped. His guns fired again and again. But for every one ship they might harass, 100 sailed past untouched. RTOR felt a profound sense of futility wash over him. He was a man with a bucket trying to empty the ocean. He looked past his own shell impacts and saw the larger picture. The Allied battleships, ships like the USS Texas, were now turning their massive 14-in guns toward the shore. Then came the reply. It started as a low rumble from across the water. He saw flashes of light from the big ships, like a silent lightning storm on the horizon. A few seconds later, the air around him began to tear itself apart. The ground began to heave. Geysers of earth erupted from the fields. The systematic industrial process of dismantling the Atlantic Wall had begun. Where was the German response? Where were the panzers? Where was the Luftwaffe? RTOR scanned the skies and saw nothing but Allied planes, fighters, bombers, transports. They owned the air completely. German doctrine called for armored counterattacks, but the closest armored unit, the 21st Panzer Division, was paralyzed by confusion and the need for a direct order from Hitler's headquarters. When it finally did move, it moved without air cover into a sky black with Allied fighter bombers, and it was decimated before it even reached the front. It was in that moment, with his own guns firing and the sky raining steel, that RTOR understood. This wasn't a fight. It was an extermination. The Allies weren't trying to outmaneuver him. They were trying to erase him. This single personal realization of overwhelming force defined the entire Normandy campaign. The story of how industrial might eclipsed battlefield tactics is complex and fascinating. If you find these deep dives into the lesser-known perspectives of history compelling, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. It allows us to continue bringing these crucial human stories to light. As the naval bombardment intensified, something in RTOR's mind shifted. The tactical part of his brain shut down. It was replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He was no longer seeing ships and soldiers. He was seeing the system behind them. He was seeing the factories. Through his trembling binoculars, he looked past the warships and saw in his mind's eye the assembly lines of Detroit. He pictured factories churning out trucks and engines on a scale Germany could only dream of. The logistics of this invasion, the ability to supply hundreds of thousands of men on a hostile shore, wasn't a miracle. It was a simple result of that industrial output. He looked at the sky filled with an endless stream of C-47 transport planes and fighter bombers. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew maybe 300 sorties in all of France. The Allies flew over 14,000. For every one German plane in the sky, there were more than 40 Allied ones. The reason wasn't a failure of German courage. It was the factories. And then there were the tanks. He knew the reputation of the German panzers. The Tiger and the Panther were technologically superior, feared by Allied crews. But that superiority was a strategic dead end. They were complex, expensive, and difficult to produce. For every fearsome Tiger tank that rolled off the line, the Allies were stamping out dozens of simpler, but brutally effective Sherman tanks. In the entire year of 1944, the US alone would produce over 29,000 tanks. Germany's peak monthly production, by contrast, never topped 2,000. The Allies weren't planning to win tank battles through quality. They were planning to win by burying the panzers under a mountain of steel. This was the new reality. This was the industrial equation of defeat. All the talk of willpower and ideological strength dissolved in the face of these numbers. Nazi ideology had promised that a unified, determined people could triumph over decadent democracies. But here was the proof that ideology couldn't stop a bomber. Willpower couldn't sink a battleship. RTOR felt a profound, almost spiritual despair. He and his men were good soldiers. They were about to die, not because they were outfought, but because they were outnumbered on a scale that defied comprehension. They were participants in a contest that was already over. He and his men, the entire German army in the West, were like a finely crafted sword facing a steam-powered Drothamer. The outcome of the contest was never in doubt. He thought of the propaganda posters and the unshakable belief back home in final victory. It was all a lie. Not just a political lie, but a mathematical one. The German High Command must have known. They must have seen the production charts. Yet, they had sent him, and millions of others, to fight a war they could not possibly win. It's no wonder that in the war's final year, the psychological strain and the confrontation with this impossible truth led to a rise in suicides among officers on the front lines. They weren't just fighting soldiers from America, Britain, and Canada. They were fighting the full unrestrained power of the global industrial complex. As the sun climbed higher, the theoretical became a brutal reality. The naval bombardment reached a crescendo, a constant rolling thunder that never ceased. The concrete of the bunker shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling. Through the observation slit, RTOR saw the first waves of landing craft hit the shore. Higgins boats dropped their ramps, disgorging American soldiers into the surf. The machine guns in the German pillboxes along Omaha Beach began to chatter, tearing into the ranks of the first men ashore. From his vantage point, RTOR could see the terrible drama unfold, the water turning red, the bodies piling up. The German 352nd Infantry Division was exacting a horrific price. For a moment, it seemed the defense was holding. The Americans were pinned down. But then the industrial equation asserted itself again. Allied destroyers, seeing the slaughter, did something suicidal and heroic. They steamed directly towards the shore, some closing to within 1,000 yards, scraping their hulls on sandbars. They turned their guns on the German bunkers, providing direct fire support in a move that turned the tide on Omaha. At the same time, strange new machines began to appear. RTOR watched as amphibious trucks, the WWII, seemingly drove directly out of the ocean and onto the beach. He saw tanks crawling ashore, some equipped with giant flails to detonate mines. These were Hobart's funnies, specialized armored vehicles. The British had developed to overcome exactly these kinds of defenses. The Germans had nothing like them. The scene on the beach below turned from a struggle into a methodical process of annihilation. German strongpoints were systematically blinded and destroyed by naval shells, tank rounds, and bombs. On Omaha Beach alone, estimates suggest the 352nd Division would suffer somewhere around 200 casualties that day. A staggering percentage of its fighting force wiped out in a matter of hours. RTOR's own battery was now a prime target. Shells landed closer and closer. A direct hit on one of the gun pits sent a fireball into the air. Another gun was knocked out. His telephone lines went dead. He was isolated. His command shattered. He looked up at the sky one last time. It was a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the sea, the first wave of landing craft was being replaced by a second and a third. Beyond them, the vast armada waited patiently. A relentless flow of men and machines that appeared endless. The Allies brought ashore nearly 500 tanks on DDay itself. The struggle for the beaches continued. But the result was already certain. It was now only a question of time and firepower. The battle for Normandy would continue for 2 more months. The fighting in the hedgerows would be savage and costly. Yet it would alter nothing. Each German tank destroyed was gone for good. Every Allied tank lost was replaced several times over. Every fallen German soldier left a void that could not be filled. For Oberleutnant Karl Weiss and the thousands who endured that first day, the remainder of the war was merely an epilogue. They kept fighting, driven by duty, fear, or a patriotism detached from truth. But the belief in victory was gone. It had dissolved in the first light of June 6th. We often imagine the fall of the Third Reich as a slow, painful descent ending in the ruins of Berlin. Yet, for the soldiers along the Atlantic Wall, the end arrived in one shattering instant of realization. It was the moment they witnessed a fleet stretching across the horizon, a sky thick with enemy aircraft, and a force that was more than an army. It was the full, unstoppable power of modern industry. This was a new kind of warfare, waged not in the hearts of men, but on the production lines of factories far away. And for one German officer, staring through his binoculars at a sea turned to steel, it was the morning he understood it was over.